Hello and welcome to BBC World News. Well, in just the last few minutes, the news agency Interfax has said that Russian forces are now holding their fire with the aim of opening humanitarian corridors from Kyiv and 4 other cities. The United Nations has emphasised the corridors have to be safe to be workable. And crucially, it's not clear at the moment if all the routes being offered are acceptable to Ukraine, which says its previous efforts, as shown here, have channelled refugees towards Belarus and Russia itself. In a separate development, a senior Russian military commander is reported to have been killed in a battle near Kharkiv. Let's hear more from James Reynolds.
Ukraine claims that its forces have killed a Russian Major General, Vitaly Gerasimov, near the second Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, which is being shelled by invading forces. Russia has not confirmed the claim. In war, the death of generals is counted one by one. By contrast, the death of civilians comes in much greater number. The Russian military continues to bombard Ukrainian towns and cities. Ukraine's emergency services have posted these pictures of oil depots in the northwestern city of Zhytomyr reported to have been hit in overnight airstrikes. They've not been independently verified. Many Ukrainians are forced to flee their homes. Others, though, remain where they are.
I'm staying here in Kyiv, on Bankover, not hiding, and I'm not afraid of anyone, as long as needed to win this war, our national war.
More than 1.7 million Ukrainians have now fled their country, many to neighbouring Poland. This has become the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. To remember seeing anything like this, you'd have to be over 80 years old. There'll be more direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. Russia has offered its own escape routes for civilians. But Russia's routes would take Ukrainians either to Russia itself, or its ally Belarus, or it would leave them in the middle of the war. It's something that Ukrainians cannot accept. It's a point that President Zelensky will make in an address to the UK Parliament later this afternoon. He's also expected to repeat his call for a no-fly zone above Ukraine. And the UK government has announced further aid, but it's been strongly criticised for taking in only small numbers of Ukrainian refugees. Attention is also turning to energy. The money that Russia gets from its oil and gas sales helps to fund its invasion of Ukraine. So across the West, there's now increasing discussion of a possible energy embargo. And Western companies continue their retreat from Russia. IBM is the latest company to leave. James Reynolds, BBC News.
Thanks to James. Well, as he mentioned there, the United Nations has made an emotional plea for civilians in Ukraine to be spared. That was at an emergency meeting at the Security Council in New York yesterday. Its head of humanitarian affairs identified 3 immediate priorities to lessen the pain and suffering in Ukraine.
The parties need to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian homes and infrastructure in their military operations. This includes allowing safe passage for civilians to leave areas of active hostilities on a voluntary basis in the direction they choose. We need safe passage for humanitarian supplies into areas of active hostilities. Civilians in places like Mariupol, Kharkiv, Melitopol and elsewhere desperately need aid, especially life-saving medical supplies, the kind that have been brought in these past days by WHO.
Let's take a look at some of the areas. Well, the Mayor of Lviv has said the city is at its limit for capacity of helping people who have fled the violence. More than 1.7 million people, most of them women and children, have left Ukraine. That's according to the United Nations. They're crossing the borders to neighbouring countries to the west, such as Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary and Moldova. It is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Our correspondent, Lucy Williamson, is in the Moldovan capital, Chisinau, and gave me this update.
We were at the border talking to many of those refugees who were walking across, and we've now actually moved up here to the capital. This is one of the shelters that Moldova is running for refugees coming to the country. 600 beds inside. It's probably a little bit quiet here today. That's because people are just waking up. Breakfast is just starting to be served. These sorts of shelters are really filling up here in Moldova, and that's partly because the flow of refugees here is changing a little bit. The first wave of refugees, as you might imagine, were perhaps more prosperous. They were often arriving in cars, staying in hotels. Those we're seeing crossing the border now, many more people on foot, many more vulnerable people, and shelters like this that the government is providing are all they have to rely on. I've spoken to so many people who turn up at the border and just have no real idea what to do next, and so that's when the government steps in with the transport and they bring people to places like this.
It's so interesting. With Moldova, I mean, how do you think the people of Moldova feel about refugees crossing over? It is, of course, so close to, I suppose, what could be a trouble spot as well if Putin advanced.
I think there's been a real sense of solidarity. Lots of people along the border and elsewhere have been taking people into their homes. In the first few days here, people were turning up in their cars on spec, as in many other places, picking up people, trying to offer help, setting up stalls. It is a destabilising moment for Moldova. The government has said it is concerned with the number of refugees coming in. This is a tiny country. I think they've received something like, the number of refugees is something like 10% of the population of Moldova. Now, not all of those stay here. About 100,000 people have actually stayed here in Moldova, but it's still a lot for this country to handle, and they have been asking for and receiving help from outside to handle that. But as I say, I mean, being up at the border, you can see there's no sign of that flow stopping anytime soon.
Thanks so much to Lucy. Just as I was listening to Lucy there, I did see that the UN refugee head has said if the war continues, we will start seeing people with no resources and no connections fleeing Ukraine, just to pick up on one of the points that Lucy was making there.